Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me on this Thursday broadcast. We're going to be getting into a number of different issues. Of course, we'll certainly be talking about the pandemic. And one of the lead articles that we'll be talking about a little bit later this hour, and certainly tomorrow, and even a little bit later in the next hour, is the sources that believe that the coronavirus really did originate in the Wuhan lab. And so we'll talk about that. The question of whether or not we're going to get herd immunity. This is the idea of more people actually have contracted the coronavirus than we might have originally suspected. Maybe is going to be evaluated by some of the facts and figures and statistics we'll get into. A lot of people expressing some concerns about this idea of providing immunity passports if indeed we're going to once again get America back on its feet. And so we've even posted some articles here on what the guidelines might look like to reopen the country. So we have a lot to cover, and we will do that a little bit later. But if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that from time to time we like to feature the great organization called the Hope Center, because of the incredible number of ministries, including one that I work with, Pro Ministries, that are located at the Hope Center. And so from time to time, we like to feature the Hope Center in terms of talking to some of those great ministries. But I thought it would be really appropriate, since we have the new president and CEO of the Hope Center, Scott Sonju, to come in. And so we're going to unfortunately have to talk with him by phone, although I'd love to get him in studio in the future. Scott Sonju, if you're not familiar, is an individual that has served as the president of Neltec Sports, and even more recently, I think a lot of you might know him as the president of the Frisco Rough Riders. Of course, he also has been working with the Dallas Mavericks in the past, and had been at Camp of the Woods, an organization we talk about so often, where he created the LIFT program. Graduate of Texas A&M University with an MBA from Northwestern. And Scott Sonju, just great to have you on the program with us today.
Well, thank you, Kerby. What a delight to be able to join you today, although I wish I was with you in person. I'm glad we're at least able to do this via the phone.
I might just mention that one of the other things we like to talk about, and we'll get to this in just a few minutes, is the National Day of Prayer. And, of course, that's going to change as well, and you have this opportunity for an event that people can join. So we'll talk about that. But let's, for our listeners, Scott, remind them of the Hope Center. It's been a while since we've actually had a feature on the Hope Center, and I know that we have listeners coming in and out all the time. So give us a little bit of an overview of that organization that you now run.
Sure. Well, the Hope Center began 11 years ago, and the kind of genesis for that was June Hunt, who helped bring this vision to what's now become the Hope Center. Hope Center is really, it's a physical place, yes. It's a beautiful building in Plano, 185,000 square foot facility, but it's really much more than that. Within our walls, we house 60-plus different ministries in a wide variety of ministries. Now, you have things from ministries to orphans and widows, things on missions, things on feeding the poor, and on worldview thinking, protecting religious freedom, discipleship, all types of ministries that are housed here. And really the purpose of it is to help these ministries be more efficient and be more effective, to see how we can collaborate in a variety of ways and really provide a fertile ground for the ministry to really thrive here. And so that's what the Hope Center does and is. And we have a wonderful staff here who helps make all these programs work. and just wonderful ministry partners here out in Plano. So if someone has not been out, if you're in the North Texas area and haven't seen the Hope Center, you can't come right now, but when it is safe to do so, we'd love to host and show you around the Hope Center.
Let me give my testimony to it as well, and that is, first of all, we're going to have in studio with us tomorrow Kelly Shackelford, and he's on the first floor at First Liberty, and I think actually I was the one that first told him about the fact that this might be an opening for him, but I've jokingly said before that it has certainly made it very easy for me to not have to drive all over the Metroplex, because in the old days, not so long ago, if I wanted to go and be with our friends at ACSI, since we worked with them many times, I'd have to get in a car, and it would at least be a 20-minute drive to the other end of town. If I wanted to see Kelly Shackelford, I'd have to drive to another part of Plano and then walk up a set of stairs. Then sometimes we've worked with a variety of different apologetics ministries, like Josh McDowell, for example, and different ministries that were involved in some kind of evangelistic outreach, like the East-West Ministry or E3 Ministries, used to be called Global Missions Fellowship. Now I just go up and down an elevator, and it has made it very easy. And Scott, one of the things I think you've noticed already coming in is that there's a tremendous amount of synergism, because some people are working in the area of the Muslim world, and so they can get together. Some are working to reach out to orphans, and they can work together. And so that synergism, which was really kind of the vision, really seems to be taking place.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and I think we'd love to see how we can cultivate even more of that. But it's fun to see these different ministries coming side by side, learning from one another, partnering on certain projects and things. And there's just a diversified skill sets and knowledge within the Hope Center. And so there's such opportunities for these ministries to be more effective, to learn from one another, to partner together. And we try to facilitate things within different disciplines that all these ministries will have to be dealing with, whether it's on finance or marketing or social media and fundraising, development, all these different aspects, and that folks are kingdom-minded. They have their own ministry callings and things they're involved with, and these ministries have their own boards and all that. Yet we're in a place that really lends itself to a lot of encouragement and cooperation, and from that even new things can spawn. And so very excited to be part of this now.
Let me just mention this before we go to a break, and then we'll get into it in a little more detail. One of the things I always like to do is feature the National Day of Prayer. We oftentimes have interviews that we've done with some of the coordinators. We sometimes open up the phones after that event has taken place, which is always the first Thursday of May. And this is going to be a little different, and in some respects, it's not going to be as interesting in some respects because we can't be face-to-face, but in other ways, it's going to open this up, because when I sometimes tell people about some of these opportunities to participate with the National Day of Prayer, they can't leave their work or they can't travel across town. But what's coming up is that there will be an opportunity on Facebook, a Facebook watch party that will take place at noon Thursday, May 7th. And so, Scott, I think this is just going to be a great opportunity for a number of people to participate that maybe never could have participated before.
Yeah, what a wonderful thing it is living in this time of history with the technologies available to us, that though we're not able to meet in person, we're able to still have impact and form a online community to pray together, to pray for this nation, and really, as you said, to really open it up to even way more folks who can be part of this. And so we're very excited. In the past, we've had quite a few folks stream our actual live program that was going on here at the Hope Center. This will be the 11th time that the Hope Center has participated in the National Day of Prayer, but it's the first one we've had that's going to be virtual. It'll be online, and folks, as you mentioned, can do that through Facebook with us, or if they go to thehopecenter.org, our website, thehopecenter.org, there's a link for National Day of Prayer, and show folks how they can be involved with this on May 7th. We're very excited about this format. We're
going to take a break, but as we do so, let me just mention that we have a link on our website, pointofview.net, that has a link to, of course, the website we just mentioned a minute ago. Also a link to Facebook. You go to facebook.com/thehopecenter. But you don't even have to remember all that, because we have all the links there to the website, to the Twitter feed, and to the Facebook page. And I would really encourage you to do so. There's no necessarily any need for you to RSVP. But if nothing else, you might want to go there right now and check it out. Watch this interview, and then, of course, join us on this virtual event. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives want to investigate the U.S. response to the coronavirus pandemic. In Watergate investigative style, they want to know what the president knew and when he knew it. It looks like merely another attempt to criticize the president, but if they're really interested in knowing what we knew back in January, the person they should question is Senator Tom Cotton. While most of Congress was preoccupied with other matters, like impeachment, the senator was warning the U.S. government of an impending danger. On January 22nd, the Arkansas senator sent a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services warning that the Chinese communists were likely censoring key information about the disease. During the impeachment trial, the U.S. Senate held a classified briefing on the virus. Only 14 senators showed up for the hearing. By January 28th, his letter to many cabinet officers was calling for a ban on travel from China to the U.S., while also urging an evacuation of Americans from China. He even missed hours of the impeachment trial because he was meeting with administration officials. Why did he see the danger that so many others missed? Well, he says that he'd been aware of Chinese government's dishonesty for years. He also noticed the extreme measures the government was taking in January, putting more than 7 million Chinese in lockdown. People were confined to their apartments. Sometimes the front doors of the buildings were welded shut. The words of the Chinese communists were meant to be reassuring, but their actions told another story. They were doing all they could to stop the spread of the virus. Senator Cotton is not a doctor, nor even a healthcare expert, but he could see what China was doing and did what he could to alert the president and the U.S. government. He deserves our thanks. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back in a few more minutes with Scott Sonju, who again is the president and CEO of the Hope Center, which is located in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And if you are not familiar with that, we have some very important links for you. First of all, you can go to thehopecenter.org, or actually you can type in thehopecenter.org/NDOP, which stands for National Day of Prayer. If you do that, you will see the various speakers. I want to talk about that in just a minute, but also you can go to facebook.com and then go to the Hope Center National Day of Prayer, THCNDOP. And if you say, well, I don't have all that down, good news is we have it on our website, pointofview.net, all the links that you will need. And we, as we get closer to May 7th, will remind you of this again, because I know many of you have said, I'd love to be at a National Day of Prayer, but I'm at work. Got a feeling you won't be at work, but even if you are, during your lunch hour, you can just pop up Facebook and you'll have a chance to participate with us in that regard. And Scott, let's, if we can, talk about this because, of course, you will provide the opening. The close is by Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, who's a good friend of this ministry. Sometimes he sits across the table as a guest. Sometimes he sits in this chair as a guest host and has been a good friend. But you also have speakers for military, business, church, community, education, family, government, and media. And this is something that has really been a tradition at the Hope Center for many years, hasn't it?
Since the founding of the Hope Center, you're exactly right. And so this will be the 11th time that we've been involved with the National Day of Prayer. And as you mentioned, 8 different pillars there that we like to focus on. There's really 7 official ones for the National Day of Prayer. And then we added community this year as a new one. But we have representatives to pray over each of those types of areas from business, church, education, as you mentioned, family, government, media, and all that. And I need to mention something else about Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, who's one of my favorite people. He's also a board member of the Hope Center, and so one of my bosses as well. And he'll do a great job as he does our thank you and closing prayer for this program.
Might I also mention another person on that board is Nick Pitts, who sat in this chair as well when we've done our Millennial Roundtable. So I know quite a number of the people on your board and just very impressed with it. And so, again, you can find all sorts of information about this National Day of Prayer, and mark your calendar right now for Thursday, May 7th at noon, and you can actually join the Facebook watch party. But I thought for just a few minutes, Scott, we might get to know you a little bit better. And let me just first of all say that the Sonju family has been such a blessing to my life. Your father and your mother, we've worked with them for years. Your brother worked with him on the lift, worked with your sister, and all of the rest. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the blessing the Sonjus have been. But there have got to be a few people, Scott, wondering, and you addressed it when you first started at the Hope Center, how did a guy that's been in sports, basketball and baseball, ended up in a Hope Center kind of situation, which is full of ministry?
Sure. All my years working professionally on the business side of sports, I've always, on my own time, been very involved in various ministries in various capacities. Sometimes that's through giving or volunteering or being on the board or speaking at something and seeing something. And so I was plugged into quite a few different ministries over the years. And I'm kind of mid-career time looking at the things or the ways I want to prioritize my time. And the Hope Center, I got approached by them with the opening of the president and CEO role. And I went home and showed my wife the job description. And as she was reading through all the different items, she's like, well, that describes you, that describes you, that describes you. And it seemed to be a really interesting fit. And she said, Scott, the things you get excited about are kind of kingdom things. You love connecting folks and really building things, and that this could be a real good fit. And so I was very excited for the opportunity to come on board with this. Part-time on my own time, I still do some sports consulting on the business side of sports, the relationships I built with that. Some of those relationships will bear fruit for the Hope Center. So I'm glad to be able to keep involved with that. I was very familiar with many of the ministries within the Hope Center before I came here to work, but it's been fun to get to know the rest of them. And as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of them, and what a privilege it is to be able to spend more time allocated towards kingdom-building activities.
Let me just mention, too, if you go to thehopecenter.org, click on that button that says nonprofits, and then that list just goes on for more than a few pages, actually, of the various partners. And as we have pointed out, from delivering Bibles and planting churches and caring for the orphaned and counseling the brokenhearted and all sorts of ministries, many of which we have featured here on Point of View and will continue to do so. Certainly is the case. But let's just, before we wind down here, talk about when this does open up. There are just tremendous opportunities for the Hope Center, and I encourage people to take the time to drive over there because, first of all, as they go in the door, they're going to say, you have a bookstore there, you have a cafe there, you have a chance to meet individuals. And, of course, this is where a lot of events are taking place. So we can't invite them to do this today, but shortly we hope that we'll be back to business. And as people come in the door, talk about all the things that really are available, even to people outside of these ministries that are existing in the Hope Center.
Sure. This past year, Kerby, we had 40,000 people come through our doors here at the Hope Center. And so we have a lot of events and activity that take place. What I hadn't mentioned yet is we have beautiful meeting space and a conference center that can house up to 600 people. And so there's many, many different events that are hosted throughout the year, many by the ministries within our building using that space, others put on by the Hope Center itself, and others by different ministry partners in the community who are not housed within our doors, but we let use our facilities and host some really wonderful events for the community, all types of things. And so hopefully as things get back to normal sooner than later, we look forward to people coming up here. If they're not familiar with us, they can pop up here. We give them a tour and show them different ways they can get involved. There's many different opportunities to get involved, to volunteer, and to be involved in all these different ministries. You'll find many folks who find out about the Hope Center center that love what we're doing, and then they really enjoy certain specific ministries in here that really resonate with them, and a chance for them to be involved with those ministries. And so hopefully by the balance of the year, or the fourth quarter, we can start having a lot more events, because that's something we really miss, is opening up our doors to the community and having so many folks come in from the outside.
Well, again, I couldn't many times walk through the Hope Center without somebody saying, Kerby, and it'd be somebody that I knew from Crew, that was from Japan, or an individual that was from the headquarters in Orlando, or an old friend that maybe I knew from Dallas Theological Seminary days or whatever. And then we go up, and in the old days we used to shake hands. I guess we're not going to do that much anymore, but it was just a great meeting place. So let me encourage you to find out more. And one other point I might make is there's a button there that says donate, and I would encourage people to consider donating to the center. Now, they might say, well, I already give to some of those ministries. Yes, you do. But I also want you to understand that those ministries benefit tremendously because there is a Hope Center, and they pay a much lower lease rent and don't have to deal with so many of the other kinds of utility questions that used to exist. So by supporting the Hope Center, you're really indirectly supporting all of the ministries in that building, aren't you?
Kerby, you're exactly right. I kind of describe it as a mutual fund here of ministries, and it's a very efficient way of folks donate directly to the Hope Center that's used to benefit all the ministries within our doors. And so we want people to also be giving to specific ministries that resonate with them and whatnot, but the Hope Center is a very efficient way to affect 60 different ministries with one gift. And so we very much appreciate that, so that we can keep our rents so below market rates, as well as provide all the services we provide for the ministries here to help them be more effective.
Yes. And again, some people say, I used to say 40, and it's now at 60. Well, that's because of the Hope Hub. So that's just another thing that has developed as well. So, Scott Sonju, it just is great to chat with you by phone, but let's see if we can get everybody back to work here. I'd love to not only get you in studio, but to have you feature one of the many ministries there, because we like to give the opportunity for people to know about the great organizations that are part of the Hope Center. Each one of them, of course, is financially supported as well, member of ECFA, as is the Hope Center. And it's just a great organization. I wanted people to know about that. And so thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, thanks so much for your long friendship, and appreciate your support, and look forward to us fellowshipping in person, hopefully sooner than later.
We certainly look forward to that as well. Let's take a break, and let me say again, such a debt of gratitude that I owe to the Sonju family, and whether it's Scott or his brother or his sister, mother, father, just have been an incredible family, such a blessing to us, and to have to now see him at the Hope Center is a real encouragement as well. When we get back, let's, if we can, talk about a couple of issues in the news. We're going to spend some time getting into some of these topics over the next about hour and a half. And then in the 2 o'clock hour, we're going to have an opportunity to talk with Bruce Herman, a painter and an educator who, again, was supposed to be here in studio, but we'll have a chance to talk with him by phone. And also we'll have Steve Miller join me as we have a conversation about how should Christians think about the arts? I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. But we come back, let's get into this pandemic and some of the questions on the table. We'll talk about that right after this.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to get into some aspects of the pandemic and of the attempt to try to put America back on its feet and reopen the country in just a few minutes. But I thought sometimes after a while you just get weary of hearing about the coronavirus and pandemic. So let's talk about some of the things we would have been talking about right now. And one of those has to do with a threat that the president made that he wanted to use his constitutional authority to adjourn both chambers of chambers of Congress, I should say. And you might say, well, I didn't think they were in session anyway. No, but there's a little bit a game being played right now. And so I need to kind of give you the backstory to understand what we're going to read. And that is, under the Constitution, there is a proposal for the president to make what's called a recess appointment. And what happens is that when Congress is in recess, if there is a need to get someone in a position of authority within the executive branch, the Congress will allow the president to actually get a recess appointment, which only can last for 1 year. Now, let's first of all recognize that this has been very significantly abused, and I mean both by Republicans and Democrats, but it certainly was used quite a bit by the previous president, Barack Obama. As soon as Congress would adjourn, any appointment that he knew would not have a chance of being confirmed in the Senate, he would actually then create a recess appointment. And that particular case, in one case, went all the way to the Supreme Court. So, first of all, it has been abused and misused by presidents, both Republican and Democrat. So then the game that gets played by Congress is to say, well, we won't formally adjourn. Every day we'll leave somebody behind who will then go through sort of a pro forma activity of opening the Congress and then closing it right back down. So while a game is being played on one side by the president, a game is being played on the other side by Congress. I'm an equal opportunity grief giver. I think they're both wrong, and it's time to actually start acting a little bit more mature about this. But given the reality, now maybe you can understand why President Trump is doing what he's doing, because he said yesterday that he would actually threaten to use his constitutional authority to actually formally adjourn both chambers of Congress so he then can make recess appointments and fill some vacant positions in the administration. He makes that argument that this is necessary because of the urgency of the coronavirus pandemic. I won't dispute that. I think it's something. Let me give you the direct quote from the president from his press briefing. He said, "The Senate should either fulfill its duty and vote on my nominees, or it should formally adjourn so I can make recess appointments. We have a tremendous number of people who have to come into government, and now more so than ever because of the virus and the problem." Okay, I think that's probably a fair statement. He doesn't really want to use his recess appointment, but at the same time, if you are going to play this game of actually pretending you're actually still in session when you're not, then we're going to have a problem. And, of course, the argument in this article, which, of course, mostly is usually critical of President Trump, is no president has ever used his constitutional authority under the recess appointment clause of the Constitution to appoint public officials unless the Senate is in recess. The upper chamber is in recess until May 4th, but has been conducting pro forma sessions in the meantime. So that's where, again, quoting from the president, "The current practice of leaving town while conducting a phony pro forma session is a dereliction of duty that the American people cannot afford to do during this crisis. It is a scam. What they do, it's a scam, and everybody knows it, and it's been that way for a long time." And I would absolutely agree with him on that. And just the other day, you had the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, say, we need to have the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, leave her mansion. By the way, she was on one of the late night talk shows last night showing everybody her freezer. She opens up one of the freezers and shows all the ice cream in the freezer. Okay, but again, he's been saying, the president is working. Why isn't Congress working? And so it's a good question. And so if nothing else, as much as I disagree with the whole game that is played and has been played for some time about recess appointments, I also disagree with the game that has been played by those trying to prevent that by having a pro forma actual session when actually the Senate isn't in session. So let's stop the games. Let's go on with the business of the American people. And right now, it is, I don't think, fair that we are paying for individuals who are sitting home and not doing their work. Fortunately, we're paying enough people right now to stay home and not work because of the coronavirus. But can we not figure out a way, even using Zoom calls and some people in the session in the chamber, others by Zoom calls, continuing on the work of Congress, because there's some things that really need to take place. And this, again, just I won't belabor it any longer, is an abuse of this. Sure, there needed to be recess appointments back in the day when a member of Congress, say, was in Kentucky and had traveled to Washington, D.C. Then they actually had a time in which Congress was in recess, and the individual went all the way back to Kentucky to meet with constituents. Yes, then there was no need always to call Congress back into session. You could allow a president to have a recess appointment. This game is now getting played more and more because we simply are using this as one more tactic against a president that is of the opposite party. And I've seen it used by Republicans. I've seen it used by Democrats. I've seen it happening by Republican presidents and Democrat presidents. And I think the president's right. You know, give me an up or down vote on these individuals, or we will then use a recess appointment. So, and while I'm talking about running out of money, I thought I'd mention this one, too, because if you might remember 2 weeks ago, we had Kelly Shackelford in here talking about the Paycheck Protection Program. This is by the Small Business Administration. And the Small Business Administration now has stopped accepting applications for this particular program. There was $349 billion in that fund. And this is to help small businesses, as well as we pointed out, even nonprofit organizations. The loans are available on a first-come, first-served basis. There is now no remaining funding in the Small Business Administration because the other $250 billion that was proposed by the Senate was blocked by some of the Democrats. Now, the Democrats say that they're just playing games with the SBA money. Okay, maybe, but I think also we now have businesses and even nonprofit organizations which no longer can even file an application for that. It turns out that they haven't used all $349 billion. They've actually used $339 billion, but that's because you have about $10 billion, which is needed to cover the fees and processing. So essentially, yes, they have used it all up once they use the fees. And so more than 1.6 million applications have been filed with the Small Business Administration through businesses and various kinds of nonprofits. But until the Senate can approve the additional $250 billion, you know, that Senate that's supposedly in session but really isn't in session, you can see how this game gets worse and worse by the day. Then no one else, whether it's a mom and pop grocery store, whether it's a craft store, whether it's a Christian ministry, whether it's a church, can apply for any of that loan. And again, as we pointed out, it is a loan, but if after 8 weeks, as I understand it, you no longer have let anyone go, in other words, you have not furloughed somebody, you've not fired somebody, then the loan, if it meets certain qualifications, turns into a grant. And so the Paycheck Protection Program at the moment is out of business because we can't seem to get members of Congress to come back and approve an additional $250 billion. And the reason for that is that the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer simply said, no, we not only want money to go towards this Paycheck Protection Program, we also want money to go to all sorts of special projects that we Democrats think needs to be funded as well. So that's where we find ourselves, and all of that indirectly is related to the coronavirus. But when we come back, let's get into probably the lead story yesterday, that sources now believe the coronavirus really did originate in the Wuhan lab, and we'll give you some of the evidence for that, and even talk about what is happening in other countries around the world, some of which, like Sweden, that have not locked down. A lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and I want to get into this whole question of whether or not the coronavirus actually originated in the Wuhan lab, which is a level 4 containment facility. And I have no hesitation when maybe we misspeak on the program to tell you that. And about 2 days ago, if you remember, I went through some of the material that was in the Daily Signal, in which that material by Fred Lucas seemed to indicate that there was no evidence at all that this virus that we are now dealing with here in the United States came from the lab. Well, maybe we were wrong. As far as I can assume now, this story that comes out from, interestingly enough, Fox News. Brett Baer was the one that broke it, but at the same time, many other news sources have carried it as well, because it now seems from individuals that work in the intelligence community. Again, sometimes we don't always agree with everybody in the intelligence community, but let's at this point assume that this is working pretty well, that they have increasing confidence that COVID-19 originated in that Wuhan laboratory. Not as a bioweapon, but again, some people say, well, how do we know it wasn't that? Well, again, I tried to give you some of that a couple of days ago, that if it was a bioweapon, it probably would have been on a little different virus skeleton. But, you never know. There's always more. But again, back to the article that we've posted. It's the first article. You can read it in its entirety. Is that then multiple sources that have briefed this believe that indeed it was something that came from that laboratory. And I'm going to go into it in a little more detail when we go to the National Hour. But the bottom line for it is really simple, and that is one of the sources say this may be the costliest government cover-up of all time. You think? Look at the absolute devastation just of the American economy. We keep talking about each day, and that's my second article here, some of the guidelines to start reopening the country. And even if we do, the hit that is taken by more than 20 million individuals who have lost their jobs, the hit that is taken to the stock market and to small businesses and all the rest, all from something which, again, if the World Health Organization hadn't repeated the lies of China, and if the Chinese communists hadn't started the lies in the first place, perhaps we wouldn't be dealing with the kind of devastation that has taken place. So if nothing else, we will come back and get into this in a little more detail, but I wanted, before this hour was up, to mention that's our first article, and I'm going to go into it in more detail in just a few minutes, because we will be joined by more than 200, well, whatever it is, the 42 different states that carry this, and the number of stations. After a while, I've kind of lost track, so I won't even give you the number of the various stations that carry this program. But just before we take a break, the other day I did mention that we might talk about what is happening in Sweden, and it turns out that if you look at this, when we go to Sweden, it has become, if you will, almost kind of like a control for the experiment. Oftentimes when you do a scientific experiment, you want to do an experiment and a control. You want to do one that has it and one that does not have it. Sometimes they do this even with various drug testing, where somebody takes a placebo pill, the other one actually takes the pharmaceutical, to see if there's a difference. And in some respects, Sweden has pretty much not had a lockdown. Now, to be fair, the people in Sweden are saying, and this is a quote from one of those individuals that is part of the Global Health Organization at Kaiser Family Foundation, saying that Sweden has kind of taken a middle path between lockdown and letting it run rampant. They do allow individuals to get together if there are less than 50 people. I did see one where they had less than 500 people, because they had actually allowed that in one particular case. So if you look at this, they have, in many cases, not locked down like the United States. What is open right now? Restaurants are open, bars are open, playgrounds are open, parks are open, elementary schools are open, but interesting enough, high schools and colleges are not open. So, and that's kind of interesting how that played its out. But nevertheless, when we look at this, the death rate for Sweden is much lower than it is for many European countries, such as Italy and the United Kingdom. But if you do a comparison to the death rate of Sweden to the other Nordic countries, okay, then you have a little bit of a difference. Now, first of all, you have to factor that in, because after all, there are about 10 million people that live in Sweden, whereas there's only about 5 million in Norway, about 5 million in Finland, and about 5 million in Denmark. And I'm just rounding those numbers down, but that's basically what you have there. So Sweden is a more populous country, so you have to look at the percentage or the number per million population. And so, of course, they have not had the kind of extreme death rate that you've seen in other countries, but they do have one that seems higher than the other Nordic countries surrounding them. And even though they have not locked down, the economy of Sweden has taken a bit of a hit, but less so, according to one of the Swedish economists, than many of the other countries around it. And so that's been kind of the idea that indeed you can actually encourage people to practice social distancing and various precautions as long as the gatherings have just, if you will, 50 people or less. And so when you start looking at some of those numbers, you recognize that if indeed people are going to say that the reason these death rates are much lower is due to the lockdown, then you could certainly point to a country like Sweden, which has not locked down quite as much. And one other positive, and that is, in many cases, Sweden's healthcare system, according to this particular article, was better prepared than most for the major outbreak. And so it seems to me that they had somewhere between 500 and 1,000 beds available in hospital intensive care units, and that was a quick ramp up as well. And so in some respects, you can see that it is quite possible that they were able to not only not lock down, but get as prepared as they could. It does provide, if nothing else, kind of a control in the midst of so many different countries and even states in this country that have had a lockdown. So let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get back into some of these issues because we have a couple of very important points to actually raise. One of those, of course, is what happened in the Wuhan laboratory. Why didn't the World Health Organization alert us? And if anything, repeat some of the now known lies by China. And whether we begin to open, do we have enough evidence that opening will not cause a second reinfection, as has happened in 1918? Because once the Spanish flu was kind of contained for a time, then when the various people came back, especially those in the military, came back from World War I, at that time called the Great War, they had all sorts of parades, they had all sorts of events, and what ended up happening is a reinfection, and eventually more people died from the Spanish virus, the Spanish flu, than actually died from World War I. So we have to look at that issue, and we will do so as well. If you'd like to find some of these articles we're quoting from today, you can find them, of course, at the website, pointofview.net. And next hour, I'm going to also talk about the Take Action item, which connects very much to my Viewpoints commentary today about Senator Tom Cotton. So we'll get into that. And if you haven't taken the time to contact your two senators, I hope you'll visit the website, and we'll talk more about that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. Pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me on the Thursday edition of Point of View. I mention the day sometimes because after a while we kind of forget what day it is, and it is Thursday, especially if you've been sheltering at home for many days or weeks. I just like to provide that as a public service. And the public service we're going to provide in this first hour is going to look at a lot of different aspects of this whole issue of the pandemic. The first article that I have posted and we will talk about is sources now say the coronavirus may indeed have come from the Wuhan laboratory, which leads to the obvious conclusion that if indeed it was, and then China covered it up, this may be the costliest government cover-up in the history of the world. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Then we've posted some information about the guidelines to reopen the country. And then, of course, what has happened, as we'll maybe focus on for just a few minutes, though, not only what happened in China and what was actually being lied about or completely censored by the Chinese communists, but then how the World Health Organization itself actually perpetuated some of those lies and cost so many lives as well. So we'll get into those topics for sure. Before this hour is up, though, I do also want to help make the case for why Congress needs to be back in session. One, because of the constitutional issues of putting key people in the administration, because right now the Senate is in a sense at recess, but it has this pro forma game that's being played. We'll talk about that a little bit later, which prevents the president from being able to put some key people in key positions right now during this pandemic. And then number two, we've run out of money for the Paycheck Protection Plan, our program. And until the Senate approves some more, that is it. And so if you were going to, as a small business, or as a church, or as a Christian organization, apply for that loan, which then later turns into a grant, you're out of luck because there's no more money. And so those are some very compelling reasons for why Congress needs to do its job. The president's working. Why aren't the members of Congress working? And, of course, a fair number of other people are working. I know some of you are stuck at home trying to work, or maybe you've been laid off or furloughed. I'd love to hear from you on that regard. More than 20 million people that don't have jobs right now. That's a concern for sure, and one of the reasons to get everyone back to work in the safest way possible. So let me get into this first article. This one comes from Fox News. Actually, it was broken in large part by Brett Baer, who is with Fox News, but of course it's now been carried by others as well. And the article just simply reminds us that we maybe need to wait until we find out a little bit more, because there seems to be, as this article points out, increasing confidence that COVID-19 is likely originated in the Wuhan laboratory. That's a level 4 containment facility, not as a bioweapon. Of course, how do we know that? Well, we can get to that later. But as part of China's effort to demonstrate that its efforts to identify and combat viruses are equal to or greater than the capabilities of the United States. And this comes from multiple sources that have been briefed on the details of the early actions by China's government And, of course, those issues will certainly surface. And as they have been able to find, some of these come from classified sources, so I doubt we'll see those anytime soon. But others come from open source documents and evidence. And as I said, if indeed this is true, and there is growing evidence to believe that it is, then this, as one of the sources said, may be the costliest government cover-up of all time. Just look at the economic devastation of this economy alone. Look at the devastation worldwide. Look at the loss of life. Look at the disruption of daily life. Look at all the things that could be happening right now that aren't because of this. And so, again, asked by Fox News' John Roberts about the reporting, President Trump remarked yesterday at the coronavirus press briefing, more and more we're hearing the story. We're doing a very thorough examination of this horrible situation. The document seemed to detail that early efforts by doctors at the lab and other efforts at containment in the Wuhan wet market initially was identified as a possible point of origin. First of all, it never sold bats. And sources at Fox News that were blaming wet market was an effort by China to deflect blame from the laboratory. So, first of all, it never made sense that it all came from the wet market, because some of the people that came down with the virus were not at the market. So this might have been simply a deception on the part of the Chinese communists. On Tuesday, March 10th, a photo which was released by China's news agency talks by video with patients and medical workers at a hospital in Wuhan. Responding to the report, though, we see a variety of others that are responding. One of those is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who on Tuesday afternoon said it should be no surprise to you that we have taken a keen interest in this and that we've had a lot of intelligence take a hard look at it. I would just say at this point it's inconclusive, though the weight of evidence seems to indicate what we, of course, just already reported there as well. And certainly one thing we can say with certainty is we can say with, as they said, 100% certainty that China was suppressing data, changing data, and that samples were destroyed, contaminated areas scrubbed, earlier reports erased. And, of course, that's something we've talked about before, because even those that went out to try to alert, first of all, people in China and then around the world, a lot of those individuals simply disappeared. And then sources tell Fox News and the world that the World Health Organization was also complicit in helping China cover its tracks. And so it is not surprising that, of course, as you have probably also heard, that President Donald Trump announced that indeed the United States will immediately halt the funding for the World Health Organization, saying it put political correctness over life-saving measures. And when we come back from the break, I won't quote from President Donald Trump, but I want to quote from Dr. Deborah Birx, because she makes a case in one of our other articles we've posted here that we would have been in a better position. We might have acted quicker. We might have done all sorts of things differently if it hadn't been for the fact that the World Health Organization not only repeated, but even tried to affirm some of the things which we now know are a lie. So this article goes on for a couple pages. Again, we don't have all the kind of confirmation you would like to have, but at least the sources indicate that indeed the virus originated in that laboratory. And as part of the effort by China to maybe try to compete with the United States to show that they had equal or even greater capacities than the United States. But the accident started there. And if indeed that is the case, we'll certainly learn more about that in the future. And that is, by the way, different than what I reported just the other day as I was reading from some of the material from the Daily Signal by Fred Lucas, arguing that it's maybe not so likely that it happened there, but that maybe it originated out in the area and then eventually moved into the wet markets. Now we might be able to document that indeed it may have come as an accident. Of course, some people even think it was a bioweapon from Wuhan laboratory. Can't document any of it, but we wanted to post this article because it's kind of one of the stories that surfaced yesterday. We want to talk about it today. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives want to investigate the U.S. response to the coronavirus pandemic. In Watergate investigative style, they want to know what the president knew and when he knew it. It looks like merely another attempt to criticize the president, but if they're really interested in knowing what we knew back in January, the person they should question is Senator Tom Cotton. While most of Congress was preoccupied with other matters, like impeachment, the senator was warning the U.S. government of an impending danger. On January 22nd, the Arkansas senator sent a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services warning that the Chinese communists were likely censoring key information about the disease. During the impeachment trial, the U.S. Senate held a classified briefing on the virus. Only 14 senators showed up for the hearing. By January 28th, his letter to many cabinet officers was calling for a ban on travel from China to the U.S., while also urging an evacuation of Americans from China. He even missed hours of the impeachment trial because he was meeting with administration officials. Why did he see the danger that so many others missed? Well, he says that he'd been aware of Chinese government's dishonesty for years. He also noticed the extreme measures the government was taking in January, putting more than 7 million Chinese in lockdown. People were confined to their apartments. Sometimes the front doors of the buildings were welded shut. The words of the Chinese communists were meant to be reassuring, but their actions told another story. They were doing all they could to stop the spread of the virus. Senator Cotton is not a doctor, nor even a healthcare expert, but he could see what China was doing and did what he could to alert the president and the U.S. government. He deserves our thanks. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have some comments about how complicit China was in all of this. But one of the things I wanted to feature for just a minute is the Viewpoints commentary that I have today. I call it The Warning, and the warning comes from Senator Tom Cotton, and I want to come back to that in just a minute because we have an action item that is related to this as well. And that is, if you want to go back and say who was sounding a warning, this is where you want to give 3 cheers to the senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, because he early on recognized something wasn't right. And while most of Congress was focused on the impeachment there in January, he, by even January 22nd, had sent a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services warning that the Chinese communists were obviously censoring key information. By the way, shortly thereafter, I wrote a commentary about that because it was pretty obvious that they were. And I used the example of some of the censorship that had existed for the Spanish flu in 1918 as kind of an example of what could be happening again. And of course, now we know that was the case. Then, while indeed the impeachment trial was taking place, there was an opportunity for senators to go to a classified hearing that actually would look at the virus and look at the potential dangers. Only 14 U.S. senators took the time to go to that classified hearing. And by January 28th, at this point, Senator Tom Cotton was convinced and sent a letter to all the cabinet officers calling for a ban on travel from China to the United States. And, of course, as we well know the story, That's exactly what the president did shortly thereafter. So one of the action items we mentioned yesterday, but I want to feature again today, you can find as you go to the website pointofview.net. The middle section there says Take Action, Protecting Our Pharmaceutical Supply Chain. And you may not know, but more than half, a significant majority of the active pharmaceutical ingredients necessary for the drugs that maybe you take, maybe your friends, neighbors, family members take, are manufactured in China. Now, one of the things that candidate Donald Trump, now President Donald Trump, has wanted to do is bring various supply chains back to this country so that we aren't dependent on a country like China. And so this is a piece of legislation that has been introduced by Senator Tom Cotton, and it's entitled the Protecting Our Pharmaceutical Supply Chain from China Act. And so we are encouraging you to go to the website, or if you already receive emails from us, you no doubt received an email last night, which gives you a link so that you can then let your 2 United States senators know that you would like to get an up or down vote, hopefully a positive vote, on this particular piece of legislation that's aimed at protecting us from no longer being dependent on China. You know, we've talked about this in terms of the energy crisis. You know, oftentimes we're dependent on energy from countries that don't really like us, and some of that money we spend to get that energy then goes to fund terrorists. And we've tried to become more energy independent so that we aren't dependent on those countries. Well, this is similar to that in that we really don't want to be dependent on China to produce these substances that then are used by each one of us. Matter of fact, recently, you saw the communist Chinese government even threaten that they might withhold some of this or might slow down the supply chain or even cut the supply chain. It's time for us to act. And so I would encourage you to go to the website. And if you've done this before, just type in your name and everything will pop up. If you haven't, then we'll need your name, address, and everything, especially your state, because we need to have the computer then put the 2 U.S. senators' names up there, the emails. And then we have a sample letter that you can send. And all you have to do is simply go to pointofview.net, click on that particular section that says Take Action. And once you've clicked on all the necessary buttons, it will send it off, and you've done your civic duty. I might just mention next week we'll probably do something related to the governors, because, after all, it's going to be really incumbent on the various state governments and the state governors to make some of those decisions. So we're going to give you a chance to even contact your governor. But today, the action item is contact your 2 senators. This should not necessarily be that controversial. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. I don't care if you're a liberal or conservative. This just, to me, makes sense. But we also need to get Congress acting. And in just a little bit later, we're going to talk about the fact that Congress has, I think, sometimes shirked its duty. We need to get them back into session. Everybody else in government that is working. I think it's time for them to get back working as well. Now, they don't all have to be sitting next to each other. They can spread out. Matter of fact, most of the time when the Senate's doing its business, it's hardly full. And you could use Zoom calls and all sorts of things like the rest of us are doing to actually have Congress in session. So that's just, again, another action item for you, which we'll talk about a little bit later. One of the other articles we posted here, people would have prepared differently, at least that's what Dr. Deborah Birx says, if the World Health Organization hadn't misled us. Here's what she said just the other day. She said when she was on The View, you really have to go back and ask yourself, why wasn't there this level of transparency when this virus exploded? She said, I think people would have prepared differently if they had known the level of transmissibility of this virus. And so she's really said that in some respects, other nations and the United States would have been better equipped to deal with this coronavirus if China and the World Health Organization had been more transparent, but they were not. Now, interestingly enough, Donald Trump also picked up on that, in which he said, had the World Health Organization done its job to get medical experts into China to objectively assess the situation on the ground and to call out China's lack of transparency, the outbreak could have been contained at its source with very little death. Now, that might have been an overstatement, but nevertheless, we are now recognizing that if you just look at what has happened, for example, the virus has sickened more than 2 million people worldwide, killed more than 25,000 people in the United States. And this particular article suggests that it originated in the wet market. Now, of course, we have another article that contradicts that. And, of course, we'll find that out as well. And this article goes on to remind us that the Chinese government silenced all sorts of whistleblowers and has a link to the individuals, some of whom just simply disappeared, or others supposedly died from the virus, and maybe they did, but, with the Chinese government, you can't trust anything. And then, of course, you had, even on January 14th, while Senator Tom Cotton was warning about the dangers, what was the World Health Organization saying? Quote, preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus. If indeed that had not been said, if instead they said, we are not sure whether this could be transmitted from human beings, would that alone have maybe changed the equation that we've been talking about here? So that's just another issue of talking about what has been transpiring overseas. And when we come back from the break, I want to take on something else, because there is becoming more and more evidence that people wonder whether or not the death count is accurate. You have on one side individuals, especially in the media, that are saying there's probably an undercount, and there probably is, because some people are dying at home and they haven't been tested. Some people maybe even have died in a hospital or clinic, but medical examiners have been so overburdened they haven't been able to test that, which then led just the other day to the decision by the mayor of New York to actually add 3,778 deaths of patients as people that indeed did die of COVID-19, but were never tested. And so that also just about instantaneously increased the U.S. death toll by another 17%. But I want to come back and say, there could be an undercount, also could be an overcount, as illustrated by that, because after all, we recognize that there could be a distinction between dying from the virus rather than dying with the virus. And I'm not just playing with prepositions. We'll get into that in a little more detail. And then what about this idea of herd immunity? What about this idea of having various virus immunity passports? We've got a lot more to cover. But most importantly, let's open up the phones. I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. This hour, we're going to talk about the pandemic. Next hour, we're going to change it up, and we'll have a chance to talk with Bruce Herman, who is a painter and an educator, and we're going to talk about a Christian view of the arts. And Steve Miller, our producer, is going to join us in studio as well, and we'll talk about artists and the church. So a nice break from all this difficult conversation that we're having right now. But let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those calls in just a minute. But let me just, for a second, kind of set the scene, because if indeed we talk about immunity passports, or if we talk about getting the nation back to work, There are all sorts of issues that need to be answered before that. How many people have died? How many people have immunity? And through this next half hour, I'm going to try to help you see how complex that issue might be. But nevertheless, the president really has tried to begin to think through what this might look like. Actually put together the Great American Economic Revival Group, which had people from all sorts of areas of industry and manufacturing, agriculture, and all the rest. And what was so interesting is he had individuals there that are obviously not pro-Trump, like Mark Cuban and Tim Cook from Apple and all sorts of people. But that didn't keep somebody from saying, yeah, but you still have a lot of white rich people. Okay, can we just get off of that and recognize that these people probably, because they're in many cases captains of industry and others, have a better understanding of that. And I certainly feel more comfortable having a very diverse group of individuals sitting down and trying to figure out what happens next. And the plan is that maybe as many as 20 states by May 1st might begin reopening. And again, these are going to be where there is probably low population density, probably kind of pretty much in the middle of the country. But that's a positive. But again, a lot of it has to do with, do we have accurate statistics? And I just mentioned a minute ago that the other day the decision was made to add 3,778 different people to the coronavirus death toll because in some respects they showed symptoms, but they weren't tested for it, or whether or not, as we've talked about before, maybe they died of something else. And that really gets into that distinction of dying from the virus versus dying with the virus. If you died of cancer or a heart attack but tested positive for COVID-19, of course, you're listed as a COVID-19 death. But on the other hand, you also have the other issue, and that is that there are a number of individuals, especially early on, when we didn't have good testing. We lacked widespread testing of people that might have actually died but would have been considered part of the death toll. So these numbers are a little difficult to get to. And the other thing I want to put on the table is that there's a very good piece by Robert Verbruggen for National Review. He gets into the statistics more than would be appropriate here. But he says, if nothing else, we now recognize that at least we can use some numbers of 600,000 confirmed cases in the United States of people that have the virus or had the virus. And yet we have a population of 330 million people. So obviously we might have more than 600,000. But are we undercounting by what? A factor of 10? That still says that only 2% of the population actually has been exposed to the virus and thus maybe has immunity to it. And even if he says you look at one of the more optimistic pieces that came out in The Economist, in order for this to work, you almost have to say we're off by a factor not of 10%, but a factor of 100 or even 1,000. And that just doesn't make sense. So he goes through a lot of these numbers. And I won't bore you because that's sort of high-level math and all the rest. But at the end, he simply says, make no mistake, these pieces of information all suggest we're undercounting infections by quite a bit. 10 or even 20-fold undercount wouldn't shock me at all. But it strikes me as wishful thinking to believe the U.S. is anywhere near what's called herd immunity. In other words, so much of the population has been exposed, has antibodies towards that. And, of course, one of the things that we will certainly want to be doing is not just testing through your nose, which is how they've done it before, but to do antibody tests, which would do that with your blood. And if we can do that, we could certainly then determine who already has antibodies for COVID-19. But then you have another problem, and that is whether somebody who has immunity could catch it once again. So these issues are going to be a lot more complex and are not easily answered even by the best medical experts. And just an illustration kind of why we're going to have to just take this one step at a time and be prepared for the possibility that some mistakes might be made. But let's take some phone calls. And so I'll go first to Texas. right there in the Dallas area, KBDT. Bill, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, you were talking about earlier about China and their production of the medicines.
Yes.
And how dependent we become on this. I've been doing a little research on this for about the last couple months, and I discovered some other things that China's doing too. And one of them is that they have over 1 million students that they've sent into our education system to learn about engineering, to learn about medical, pharmaceutical things. And they go back into China and help strengthen and build up their industry over there and their military, et cetera. Of course, in China, just the People's Liberation Army just about controls everything there. And then the other thing is they have up to 700 corporations or businesses on our stock exchanges, and that's called both the New York Stock Exchange, the over-the-counter exchange, and NASDAQ. And they're using the investment money from the West, as we in the United States and so forth, through trying to fund our retirement plans or anything, to get the money they need through these corporations to do what they want to do in China, not only to strengthen themselves, but strengthen themselves in the world too. And I would urge everybody to take a hard look at their IRAs and Roths and everything. And if you see in there that you're in some kind of an international fund, to check that fund to see how many Chinese countries that are in there that are benefiting from your investment into that fund too.
Yes,
and I find it kind of ironic too that in Wuhan University and that area over there, one of the companies that's on the stock exchange, Chinese company, is the company that makes the surveillance equipment that they're using in their concentration camps over there, or their re-education camps, I guess you call it. So it goes a lot deeper, and it's very frightening. And I look at this and I wonder what in the world what is our, especially with the liberal Democrats and even a few Republicans, they're fascinating. What's their fascination with China? And why do they, like right now, they're even trying to defend China? And you mentioned earlier about the virus getting out of the area and everything. One of the things that happened as they try to cover this up, they got rid of a lot of their professors over there that were involved in all these studies they were doing. And some of them just literally just disappeared, and their studies disappeared too that they had posted on the internet up there for those other people to use in the Chinese research. And then they put the military totally in charge of that whole Wuhan laboratory system over there. And it's been literally locked down as far as information or anything
there you go.
that you can get out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, you've done your research, but it also, Bill, illustrates something that we've talked about before, the quote that's been attributed to Lenin, although he didn't exactly say it that way, but it's the idea that American capitalists will sell the Russians the rope that will be used to hang them. If I can update it, sometimes we capitalists in America sell China the rope that will hang us because they have been able to use all sorts of investigations, have been able to steal intellectual resources and the rest. And it's just a reminder that for those people that used to be made fun of for saying that China was an enemy, I think we finally figured that out, Bill, that China is not our friend, and we just better be very careful about what we allow them to do in this country.
Well, we're going to have to educate some people in the news media on that, too, because they're still trying to prop them up.
Yes, for sure. Bill, I appreciate you starting us off today. Thank you for calling in and educating us and illustrating once again, as I've said, that we have such an educated listenership. And so I certainly want you to think about this. And as he mentioned just a minute ago, there aren't a lot of things we can do, but one thing we can do is recognize that right now, if you are dependent on certain drugs, and maybe you are, maybe your parents are, maybe a friend is, and right now many of those drugs come from materials that are produced in China, don't you think it's about time to bring the supply chain back to the United States. And so that is why we have our Take Action item to actually encourage you to tell your 2 United States senators that you support Senator Tom Cotton. Now, those of you in Arkansas, you've already probably written to Tom Cotton thanking him, but nevertheless, again, the bill is called Protecting Our Pharmaceutical Supply Chain from China Act. And if you would like to contact your 2 senators, we just made it very easy. Simply go to the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, though, Congress has got to be in session. I'm going to talk about why that's really important right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, the other day, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said, you know, the president's working. Why aren't we working? And, of course, that goes back to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that says, no, we're not going to get together right now. And I think it is time to convene both the House and especially the United States Senate. Why the Senate? Well, first of all, we just talked about a piece of legislation that they could consider. But more importantly, Donald Trump yesterday, when he was talking about this whole issue, threatened to use his constitutional authority to adjourn both chambers of Congress so he can make recess appointments. Now, let me give you the background for this, and that is the Constitution does indeed allow, in extraordinary cases, an opportunity for the president to adjourn Congress, and it also provides for the president to actually have recess appointments. This has been terribly abused both by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. As soon as Congress is in recess, They just simply say, well, if I couldn't get my particular nominee confirmed by the Senate, I'll just have a recess appointment. Now, what was that was intended back in the 18th and 19th century when you would travel from Washington, D.C. to Nebraska, or Washington, D.C. to Texas or Kentucky or Florida. And then during that time when Congress was not in session, there was a need to have somebody in the cabinet. And so at that point, they gave the permission for the president to do so. But now, anytime Congress is not in session, then this has been used by presidents of both parties for recess appointments. Now, the bottom line is that what is happening right now is the game is being played on the other side. Not only do presidents play the game, but members of Congress play the game, because right now you really don't have Congress in session. You just have kind of a pro forma argument that, well, it's still sort of in session, even though nobody's there. And so what Donald Trump said the other day, quote, "The Senate should either fulfill its duty and vote on my nominees, or it should formally adjourn so that I can make recess appointments. We have a tremendous number of people who have to come into government, and now more so than ever because of the virus and the pandemic, and the problem," he says. And he even talks about this current practice right now of leaving town while conducting a phony pro forma sessions as a dereliction of duty that the American people cannot afford during the crisis. It's a scam, what they do. It's a scam, and everybody knows it, and it's been that way for a long time. So, of course, those people critical of the president say, now there's never been a president who's used his constitutional authority under the recess appointment clause of the Constitution to appoint public officials unless the Senate is in recess. So the upper chamber is technically in recess until May 4th, but it's got these pro forma sessions where somebody comes in and convenes Senate, but nothing really happens. And I just think, let's just stop this, especially at a time when we face a crisis. There is all the need for these members of Congress to be there. Now, they can still socially distance themselves. First of all, most of them are not in the chamber when they're there anyway. And there are some that could be in the chamber to conduct business, and the rest could be there by Zoom or something else. That's how the rest of us do this. And so, again, we are actually stifled right now because none of these appointments are actually being confirmed, because theoretically the Senate is in session, but realistically it's not. So it's time to have Congress get back and do its work. And another good reason for the Senate has to do with the fact that, according to the Small Business Administration, we're out of money. This comes back to something we talked about 2 weeks ago with Kelly Shackelford, and we'll talk with him about that tomorrow. The Paycheck Protection Program actually has run out of money. So if you are a small business, if you're a church or a Christian organization, since this applies not only to small businesses, but also to Christian organizations or nonprofit organizations, if you haven't gotten your application in, it's too late. They had 1.6 million applications that have been approved for $338 billion, and now it will be shortly $339 billion, and that's it. You might say, well, I thought we had $349 billion. Yes, well, about $10 billion of it has to be saved for fees and processing. At least that's according to Republican Senator Marco Rubio. So we are at a loggerhead. Now, you might say, well, weren't they going to actually approve an additional $250 billion? Oh, yes, they were, except the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer really kind of closed it down. The argument that we get from Chuck Schumer, and also Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, right now in her home in San Francisco. You might have seen her last night on one of the late-night talk shows where she's given people a tour of her freezers and all sorts of stuff, showing all the ice cream that she has, and on and on. Really? Do the people's work. But anyway, the reason this has not been approved is because they said, well, before we approve an additional $250 billion for small business, we want to also add to this some other ornaments on this Christmas tree, because after all, we want to be Santa Claus, and we want to actually fund all sorts of sort of liberal progressive ideas and programs as well. So we are stifled at the moment. And so any of you that are small business owners that did not get your application in time, or if, as I've been dealing with one bank, haven't even opened up the portal yet to do this, then you're just out of luck until Congress can get together and actually do what it's supposed to do. So another theme for the day. It's time for Congress to do its job. It's time for Congress to be back in session. Let's figure out some ways creatively so that it is safe, isn't dangerous to the individual's health, but at the same time allows the people's business to actually take place. So that's kind of where we find ourselves at the moment. And let me just give you kind of a preview. Tomorrow we're going to be talking with our good friend Kelly Shackelford, as I mentioned just a minute ago. Penna Dexter will be here as well. And, of course, he has this statement now from the mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, as well as the governor, that have finally said, okay, we guess we will allow drive-in church services. And, again, this was something that the mayor actually wanted to close down. Pastor Charles Hamilton of the King James Bible Baptist Church had kind of a drive-in service, but you had some of the police saying, no, your constitutional rights have been suspended. And so we're going to talk about what happened in Mississippi. Of course, some of these individuals ticketed for $500. And, of course, now the Attorney General of the United States wants to get into this. You have, of course, the Kentucky governor recording the license plates of anybody that came to that drive-in event and ordering them to a 14-day quarantine. By the way, some of the license plates were for the press. I'd love to see if they're going to make some of these reporters quarantine themselves. So we're going to get into this whole issue of, yes, we want to keep people safe. But yes, we also have to make sure that we don't lose our civil liberties and our religious liberties in the process. So that is just kind of a preview for what we're going to talk about tomorrow in our weekend edition, and hope you'll join us then. But what are we going to do next hour? Well, we're going to talk about the arts. We are privileged to have with us Bruce Herman. This is something I've written about before. This is my book, Arts, Media, and Culture. Some of these articles written by some of my colleagues on the arts, but also I've written some stuff on media and culture. But how do we think about the arts and artists and the church? Thought it'd be just a great diversion from this pandemic. And actually, Bruce was supposed to be in studio with us because he was going to be here in Dallas, and we decided, well, we'll just keep him here anyway. Even now, though he can't necessarily be in studio with us, we'll have Steve Miller in studio, our producer who works in the arts as well. And I think you'll enjoy the conversation about how should Christians think about art and artistic expression and creativity and the like. So if you are an artist, we'd like to hear from you as well. Perhaps you can add some things to the conversation. And we thought that it would be just a great diversion from this pandemic and even some of the political issues that we've been talking about today. So let's take a break. We'll talk about artists and the church right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about a Christian view of the arts, artist, and the church. And it is something we've had planned for some time, because Bruce Herman was supposed to be here in Dallas, actually speaking at Covenant School, but that did not work out. But we said, let's just keep this, because if nothing else, all the more reason to have a discussion that kind of takes our mind away from all the things we've talked about over the last couple of days and even the last couple of hours. So this is just a great opportunity to have a chance to hear from him, and in an effort to really try to add to some of the conversation that I certainly would want to have happen, I've brought into the studio somebody we've had here before, Steve Miller, who's the producer, of course, of Point of View, but as an artist in his own right, as an actor, and you perhaps have heard us from time to time mention Shakespeare plays he's been in, or various movies or other kinds of things. So if nothing else, Steve, I know you're looking forward to this interview.
Oh, very much so. Appreciate you including me in this.
And this is the individual that we have by phone, Bruce Herman, who is a painter and educator. He holds the chair of fine arts at Gordon College. And for our listeners up there in Massachusetts, you know exactly where that is. He has both undergraduate and graduate fine arts degrees from Boston University College of Fine Arts. An author of the book Through Your Eyes, which is published by Erdman's. His artwork, my goodness, it would take a while to list all the different places where it has been shown, but let's mention some of the major cities: Boston, New York, Chicago, Washington, Los Angeles, worldwide. Of course, we can talk about Cambridge University and Italy and Canada and Israel and Japan and a number of others. But Bruce Herman, it is just great that you could join us by phone.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Kerby, and you too, Steve.
I wish you were in studio, so if you do make it to Dallas, you have an open invitation to join us in studio. But, Steve, let's, if we can, now you know more about him, and I want to give you a chance maybe to ask some questions.
Oh, you bet. Bruce, first of all, I would just love to hear, to set the stage, hear a little bit about your own journey as an artist, as a teacher, how you got where you are, and maybe where all that started for you.
Well, thanks, Steve. It'll be a pleasure to share a little bit. Well, let's see. I grew up in the 1960s. I was born in the early 1950s, but grew up in the 1960s, really going to high school and then ultimately to college in the 70s. So I'm no stranger to what we're going through right now, which is a major cultural shift. And so in the 1960s, I was very much a part of that cultural shift. I grew up in a Christian family, but we were, I guess you'd call it a nominally Christian family. My parents were believers, but they weren't, solid churchgoers, and they also hadn't really been taught very much from the Bible. And it wasn't until the 70s that they actually came to a truly saving faith in Jesus. As a kid, I was a very, what they called a religious kid. I asked lots of hard questions when I was little. In fact, my grandparents used to call me the little philosopher. And the reason for that is, and I think this is true of a lot of artists, maybe you can concur, Steve, when you're a sensitive type person and, very vulnerable to both the highs and the lows that everyone goes through, but maybe just a little higher and a little lower, emotionally and psychologically, you open yourself up to beauty, to the beauty of the natural world, but also the inner worlds of the imagination. And those of you who are fans of Tolkien or C.S. Lewis know what I'm talking about here. And as a teenager, I was very imaginative, and I was also very drawn to God. I mean, I've been drawn to the Lord since I was a little boy, but I didn't really have a way to find my way to Him in a solid, straightforward discipleship. And so I sort of experimented around like a lot of people were doing in the late 1960s. I got involved in psychedelics. And also Eastern philosophy, which was very much a current thing on college campuses back in the late 60s. And that kind of got me off on a long, circuitous kind of odyssey, which took me to India, and I became a disciple of a guru, Indian spiritual teacher, who was a very wise and wonderful man on many levels. In fact, he was kind of a mentor to Mahatma Gandhi. But you know, he was not a Christian, and I was a Christian, but I didn't see any real conflict at the time. But anyway, I went through a long, circuitous path, finally finding my way back to the Lord. After being married 9 years, at the age of 30, I really committed my life to Christ and sought real biblical teaching. And at that point, I'd already had a pretty developed art career. By the time I was 30 years old, I'd had several one-man shows in the Boston area, had been written up in local newspapers and magazines, and it looked like a very promising career, but it was all egocentric. And when I became a Christian, I'd been a Christian all along, but I really committed my life to Jesus. I thought, I'm going to have to give this up because it's just too wrapped up in my my seeking for fame and name and the ego tripping, as it were. And so I enrolled at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And I thought I might become a pastor someday. And one evening, my wife Meg and I were invited to the campus for an evening event for all married couples who were seminary students. And Nigel Kerr, I'll never forget, he used to teach church history at Gordon Conwell. He was the MC for the evening. And he said, would all the married students in the MDiv program who are headed for the pastorate, please stand. And I stood up, and Meg tugged on my shirt and said, sit down. They're talking about people that are going to become pastors. and I said, well, and the couple in front of us turned around to look at us, and she said out loud, so they could hear, she said, you're an artist. I put you through art school. You're supposed to make art. And furthermore, I don't think I'm called to be a pastor's wife.
Such a great line.
So I sat down. And I thought, in that moment, this is the Lord. Yeah. This is the Lord telling me, I gave you this gift. You're an artist. You've been an artist since you were a little boy. I want you to do this, but do it for me. And the rest is history. I mean, that was 1984. So that's a bit of my journey. I could tell you more, but, really that's the crux of it for me, because after that point, my art is for Jesus. I mean, it is for Him. I don't do religious illustration like you might think of quote unquote religious art, although there's oftentimes biblical subject matter in my work, as anyone who visits my website will see. But
sure.
It's more elusive. It's not direct illustration, and that's true for a lot of the artists I know who are committed Christians.
Sure. Let me take a break. We do have one of those mandatory breaks, but let me just mention, since you already talked about your website, we do have a link to that on our website. It's bruceherman.com. You don't even have to remember that. If you happen to be traveling right at the moment, don't have a chance to write it down. It's on our website, pointofview.net. And I might also say that some of you are saying, well, it's great you're talking about art, but I'd like to see it. Okay, well, the good news is when you go to that website, there's a tab called Gallery. You can get to see some of his art. And when we come back, I thought, Steve, maybe we could talk about, some of these issues, because sometimes artists don't have a home in the church. Yeah. Now, maybe at your church, they let you do some acting, but sometimes where do artists fit in? And of course, in this book that we put together a while back, Arts, Media, and Culture, a biblical point of view, we just need to think a lot more about this issue of art. So let's, if we can, take a break. And Bruce Herman with us and Steve Miller in studio, and we'll continue our conversation on artists and the church right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives want to investigate the U.S. response to the coronavirus pandemic. In Watergate investigative style, they want to know what the president knew and when he knew it. It looks like merely another attempt to criticize the president, but if they're really interested in knowing what we knew back in January, the person they should question is Senator Tom Cotton. While most of Congress was preoccupied with other matters, like impeachment, the senator was warning the U.S. government of an impending danger. On January 22nd, the Arkansas senator sent a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services warning that the Chinese communists were likely censoring key information about the disease. During the impeachment trial, the U.S. Senate held a classified briefing on the virus. Only 14 senators showed up for the hearing. By January 28th, his letter to many cabinet officers was calling for a ban on travel from China to the U.S., while also urging an evacuation of Americans from China. He even missed hours of the impeachment trial because he was meeting with administration officials. Why did he see the danger that so many others missed? Well, he says that he'd been aware of Chinese government's dishonesty for years. He also noticed the extreme measures the government was taking in January, putting more than 7 million Chinese in lockdown. People were confined to their apartments. Sometimes the front doors of the buildings were welded shut. The words of the Chinese communists were meant to be reassuring, but their actions told another story. They were doing all they could to stop the spread of the virus. Senator Cotton is not a doctor, nor even a healthcare expert, but he could see what China was doing and did what he could to alert the president and the U.S. government. He deserves our thanks. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about artists and the church with Bruce Herman, as well as, of course, Steve Miller in studio. Let me just mention that we have a link to his website, bruceherman.com. You might want to see some of that information. If you'd like to contact him, like to see his gallery or a variety of other things, they are available. We also, of course, not only broadcast, of course, off of satellite, but we also broadcast on Facebook Live. You can go to Facebook, Point of View Radio Talk Show, and if you'd like to leave a question or a comment, feel free to do so, because we might pick some of those up a little bit later. But Steve, let's come back to this conversation with Bruce Herman.
Yeah, Bruce, you had mentioned something there at the end of the last segment about your work and that you don't necessarily do biblically themed work. I'd love to kind of use that as a springboard to talk about the concept of the artist as an outlier or a stranger. I mean, sometimes churches, we know that there can be a lot of conflict between the church and artists, and sometimes it's the church's fault, and sometimes it's the artist's fault. But I think sometimes it's because the church wants the art to come under the umbrella of what serves the church. And so when you think of religious art, I mean, that is not what you do. Let's talk maybe a little bit about what you do and why you don't feel compelled to necessarily do, quote, religious art.
Well, first of all, thanks, Steve, for that question. First of all, the whole category of sacred art, that is art that is made specifically for worship spaces, needs to be understood as one form of art, just as, there are different kinds of music, some music that was made for worship and other music that's for entertainment, music that's just for the pleasure of listening to beautiful sound and beautiful harmonies. There's a role for art in a lot of different areas of life. And, I do actually have used the word biblically themed. I do have biblical themes in my work from time to time. But what I said was I don't do biblical illustration. In other words, I don't just take a story from the Bible and try to illustrate it, although I think that's a perfectly worthy thing for someone to do if that's what they want to do, or if that's what their role is as an illustrator. I was just clarifying that there are different kinds of art. My art fits into a slightly different category.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there is room for all of it. I heard a quote from T-Bone Burnett, a music producer, who stated, I think I read this in Steve Turner's book called Imagine, and T-Bone Burnett said, if you're a Christian, you can, if Jesus is Lord, you can write songs about the light, or you can write songs about what you see by the light. He was talking about Jesus as being the light of the world. I can write songs about the light or what I see by the light. And he said, that's what I do. So I think sometimes there's room for art that by its nature is going to reflect the beauty of God. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think, it's funny. I mean, this may sound kind of trite, but if you walk out your door on any given morning, say this time of year, you're going to see flowers pushing up through the dirt. Mm-hmm. And God has created the beauty of those flowers, or the birds that are singing in the trees, the beauty of their plumage. But we don't necessarily want the flowers to arrange themselves into the word Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't want the birds necessarily. The birds don't have to sing, hallelujah chorus or something like that. I think there's beauty that is just gratuitous beauty, is there to be what it is. And that's, if there's any doubt about that, just open your eyes and look around you at any point, any time of day, any time of year. The world is suffused. It is just drenched in gratuitous beauty that has no other purpose than to just be what it is, which is a reflection of the glory of God.
You are a professor, and I wonder if sometimes you have to clear up some of those misconceptions with some of your students, or maybe even the parents of some of those students that say, oh, you're going to be an artist, and sometimes you have to maybe set some of those ideas aside, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I think, what I've often said to my students, especially students who come in and they don't have a lot of background in art and may have some misconceptions, particularly about modern art or art that's abstract, that doesn't show something that recognizable, but is just, say, a series of colors or textures or shapes. When you think about it, it's the same argument I was just starting to advance there about the lilies of the field, the wildflowers just being what they are, giving glory to God. Sometimes it's enough for a musician, a composer, to just write a melody that doesn't tell a story, it doesn't illustrate anything, it isn't a picture of anything, it shouldn't call to mind anything in particular, except just the beauty of those harmonies within that melody or with that chord structure. In music, it's easier to understand this in musical terms, but we need to begin to think in visual art as well in the same way, which is it's enough for an artist, if this is what they're motivated to do, to present to us a series of shapes and colors and textures that in themselves are beautiful harmonies and which can enhance our visual field and uplift our spirits, move us to a state of contemplation. There's lots of other, that might also be, and I know that, Steve, you brought up the question of the artist as outlier. Sometimes artists are called, just like poets and storytellers, to tell dark stories, to point us toward the dangers that are out there, the social injustices even. But there's beauty even there. For example, I think in a thunderstorm, no one would deny there's something majestic and beautiful about those towering clouds that are getting darker and darker overhead. We might run for cover, but we know there's beauty and glory there in the night sky. The same thing. So the Lord is in the pillar of flame and in the pillar of cloud. He displays His glory in both the awesomeness of creation, but also in the fragility and the beauty of the things like wildflowers.
Yeah, I love what you said about the fact that sometimes in the dark stories, in the darkness of life, there is that beauty, there is the truth. One of my favorite short story writers is Flannery O'Connor, and man, you can't get away from the darkness in her work, and she would say basically when people are hard of hearing, you have to shout. When they have trouble with sight, you have to paint in garish colors, So there's a value in that. I think that is probably some of the reason we find ourselves as artists, sometimes as outliers. If you could just touch on briefly this idea that you and I had gone back and forth on email about the Mirkstapa, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, there's a medieval, an Old English term, Mirkstapa, which was used to describe, actually, the place that it was coined was in the story of Beowulf. It was referring to Grendel, who was a marsh walker or a wilderness wanderer. But in recent years, some of us have adopted that term. Actually, my friend John Skillen was the one that began to use it. And then we were in conversation with another friend, Mako Fujimura, who has used it in one of his books now. But it's a term that we've used. Border stalker is a rough translation. And the idea behind that is sometimes the artist, like the prophet, is called to be an outlier, to be someone who preserves an outsider's status, as it were, at least temporarily, so that they can bring news of things beyond the convention, beyond the things that are safe and pretty and comforting, and shake people up a little bit, the same way the prophets, like Jeremiah or Ezekiel would, in their various kinds of public utterances, and then some of the things they did symbolically, like in Ezekiel, where he lays siege to a brick with the word Jerusalem on it, or some other even more dramatic things, in order to draw attention to injustice and unrighteousness. And sometimes that is the role. I mean, Flannery O'Connor is a great example of someone who points out to us the depravity around us. And so that's sometimes a legit role for the artist to be an outsider. But I'm, my feeling is the church still needs to welcome those outsiders. Those outsiders need to let their guard down, and they need to understand that, sometimes people aren't going to be comfortable with them, but they have to be willing. If they're speaking truth, you speak truth in love. You don't have to, be an outsider by your own choice, and just because you've got a bad attitude or stuff like that. So I think there's enough blame to go around for why artists have been strangers in the church. I don't think that that's a constructive way to go about it. I think what we need to do is to build bridges of trust. But we also have to understand that sometimes a legitimate role for the artist to bring an outsider's perspective so that people can see the truth again, because it is, let's face it, 2,000 years of church history shows us the church isn't always right.
For sure. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. Bruce Herman with us, and if you're looking for that word, Mirkstapa, so again, we have that as the word of the day, and of course, Steve Miller in studio as well. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Bruce Herman, even as we go to a break, go to bruceherman.com, or you can simply go to pointofview.net. What you'll find there is a link, and you might want to look at his bio, his gallery, and a variety of other issues. And I know we have a lot more to talk about when we come back from the break. But if you have a comment or a question, you might want to leave those on our Facebook broadcast, Point of View Radio Talk Show at Facebook, and that will be a way in which we can maybe put some of those on the screen and ask those a little bit later. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Steve Miller and Bruce Herman right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today about artists and the church, and we have Bruce Herman with us by phone, and of course Steve Miller in studio. And if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, go to the Facebook page, and we'll get to some of those in just a minute. The website, bruceherman.com. But we have a lot more to talk about, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Bruce, you had said something toward the end of the last segment, talking about artists sometimes feeling, I don't know that you used this phrase, I say put upon. I've told young actor friends of mine, maybe not all that young, just said, you can't go about this in a sort of antagonistic fashion or a standoffish sort of, oh, you don't understand me and I'm an artist, And sometimes we can adopt that sort of feeling. What are some practical ways that the artists can be more welcoming toward the church and vice versa? You did hit upon some of that. What are some other things that we can do?
Well, first off, I think it's important for people to know, especially artists, young artists who are coming up through the ranks, that the whole concept of the artist as a kind of Lone Ranger, creative genius type is a pretty recent phenomenon in the history of art. For most of the last 20 centuries, at least in the Western world, artists were like everyone else. They were craftsmen and servants, doing their job, and sometimes if they were really good, they were asked for their opinion, but they weren't. It wasn't assumed that artists were always in the driver's seat, and it wasn't assumed that they had complete autonomy. They could do whatever they darn well pleased. And so I think that's a fairly recent phenomenon in the last 100, 150 years, the idea of the avant-garde artist. And I think if artists understand that from the beginning, and they take a more humble attitude, which is, yes, your creative gifts are respected and needed. And that's answering the question about what the church can do, which is to honor and to create a place for those creative gifts of the artist, and give a job for the artist to do. By the same token, the artist can't insist upon complete artistic freedom without any censure, without any relationship to the person that they're working for and being paid by. That's a preposterous. No one in any profession expects to be paid to do what they want to do all the time. And so I think, that's been my attitude all my life as an artist, which is if someone's paying me, I need to consider what their needs are and what their desires are. And that doesn't mean that I will do just anything. I'm always free to turn down a job. And I think that kind of attitude, a more professional attitude, would be very helpful on the part of artists. Now, as far as the church is concerned, churches for about 500 years in the Protestant tradition have overcorrected for some of the excesses of some of the previous generations of Christian churches, which use the arts as kind of a propaganda campaign. And I think what happened was a lot of the Protestant churches overreacted or overcorrected by actually excluding visual arts from the sanctuary and from worship. And so it was only music, it was only preaching of the word, and hymn singing that was allowed. And even architecture suffered in the last couple hundred years. There isn't any great church architecture, or very little of it, that's been done. That's got to change. The visual, in order to bring glory to God, we need to bring everything we have, our best music, our best poetry, our best art, our best architecture, our best preaching, our best, bringing our best before the Lord. Because what happens when we worship God with everything we've got, we are blessed. We are stretched. We live into our vocation as what we're going to be doing throughout eternity, which is bringing glory to God. And I think churches that miss out on the visual aspect of worship and the beauty that could be developed and brought about in the sanctuary and in the life of the church, it's a great loss for the church. But like I said, there has to be a rapprochement, to use a fancy word. There has to be some kind of give and take on both sides, and a willingness to suspend this fairly recent attitude that artists need complete and total autonomy in order to make interesting or creative art. It's just not true. And if you think back to the great artists that we all revere, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, they didn't have complete artistic freedom. They worked with a group when they did a commissioned work. The Last Supper, Leonardo was trying to make that for a specific group of people, a specific monastery. The Sistine Ceiling by Michelangelo. He was under the authority of the church there in Rome when he did that work. I mean, there's a lot of artistic freedom that can be exercised within the reasonable, pattern of authority there.
Just incredible. Let's, if we can, ask a practical question. One of the things I sometimes do is ask when we have an actor in studio or by phone how to get into the profession. But one of the questions on Facebook is just wondering if you had maybe one of our listeners here that is a young artist and maybe wanting to go into this field. Can you give us some recommendations maybe in terms of education and training? Because after all, your path is one path, but what would you recommend to those individuals that maybe would like to get into the fine arts?
Well, like I said earlier in the show, there's all different kinds of visual art, just as there's all different kinds of music. So it would depend on the specific direction that this young artist wanted to go. For example, if there's an interest in design, and the many, many different kinds of design that are out there. There are different schools for different aspects of that particular branch of the profession. There are some great schools in New York, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Dallas, in Houston, all over the United States. There are good schools, and their different emphases depend on, so you need to do a little homework. If you're interested in the fine arts, let's say you wanted to paint traditional kinds of oil paintings of portraits or landscapes, there's one set of schools you might like to apply to. If you want to do more avant-garde, more abstract art, and you think you would like to go in that direction, there are other schools that I'd recommend. But, it's like everything else in life. You need to do your homework to figure out what your specific aims are, and then what's the best path of training to get. What I would say what you want to avoid are art schools that don't teach you anything, where they take your tuition dollars, they say, do your own thing.
Amazing.
That's been going on for a long time, and I remember back in the 70s when I was in art college, there were a lot of schools that were happy to take your tuition dollars, but they didn't really give you much for it. So you need to do the hard looking to find a school where they're really going to give you some good training.
Shifting gears just a bit, we've got a little bit of time before the segment is over. I would like to discuss the idea of art as an expression of beauty and truth and goodness, which you mentioned earlier. The idea that intrinsic in a symphony or a painting is the beauty that stirs us. That rather than using art as a didactic tool, something that the church is often guilty of, and the church isn't the only one. But could you speak into that a bit?
Sure. I'm going to read a quote for you. It's fairly lengthy, but I will comment on it. It goes like this: "Beauty is the word which shall be our first. Beauty is the last thing which the thinking intellect dares to approach, since only it, beauty, dances as an uncontained splendor around the double constellation of the true and the good, and their inseparable relation to one another. Beauty is the one not seeking selfish interest, and without which the ancient world refused to understand itself, a word which both imperceptibly and unmistakably has bid farewell to our new world, a world of selfish interests, leaving it to its own avarice and sadness. No longer loved or fostered by religion, beauty is lifted from its face as a mask, and its absence exposes features on that face which threaten to become incomprehensible to man." That's the face of religion, he's saying. "We no longer dare to believe in beauty, and we make of it a mere appearance in order the more easily to dispose of it. Our situation today shows that beauty demands for itself at least as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness, and she will not allow herself to be separated and banned from her two sisters, truth and goodness, without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance. We can be sure that whoever sneers at the name of beauty as if she were the ornament of a bourgeois past, whether he admits it or not, can no longer pray and soon will no longer be able to love."
Wow.
That's Hans Urs von Balthasar. And so he's saying that truth, goodness, and beauty, the three transcendent realities that are the character of God, cannot be teased apart. If you subtract one, you lose the other two.
Wow. Incredible. We need to take one of those mandatory breaks, but I want to come back and get a little bit more comment on that. But let me just mention real quickly that if you just happen to be tuning in, we're talking about artists and the church. In studio with me, Steve Miller, but also we are talking with Bruce Herman. And I think if you would like to know more about him, we have a link to his website, which I think you will enjoy finding as well. We also have some other information that you might want to follow. But again, probably the best place to follow and find some of this material is simply go to bruceherman.com. We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Artists in the Church is our question today, and we have Bruce Miller with us by phone and Steve Miller in studio.
Hey, Bruce, I would like to ask you, we talked about the church, art in the church, and why sometimes it is that artists feel maybe a little bit marginalized. I'm wondering how we can bring millennials specifically into the church, perhaps by way of the arts. You had said something in our conversation earlier about modern art, and you had mentioned a T.S. Eliot quote. I think sometimes the more traditional elements of the church can kind of dovetail with art. And do you see that as a possibility?
When you say traditional elements in the church, do you mean liturgical?
Let's say liturgical. Yeah, that's really what I meant. Uh-huh.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is true that for 1,500 of the last 2,000 years, the church, most of the church worldwide, thought it was really important to invest our very best in architecture, in music, in art, and that our worship space was infinitely more beautiful and intricate than our living spaces, our private living spaces. And if you have any doubt about that, just walk around Europe a little bit, or even walk around the Middle East. And even in India, when I was in India, I've seen incredible, beautiful Christian church buildings that were created 1,000 years ago there. So there's something that's been lost in the last 100 years in particular, particularly in the Protestant and evangelical tradition of giving up on bringing our very, very best before the Lord. And it's funny, if you look at our private homes, we have all kinds of, beautiful furniture, and, the homes themselves are beautiful and beautifully decorated. And we have, nice meals and, good electronic gadgets and whatnot. And our churches sometimes are kind of plain Janes. Yeah. They're like cinder block boxes. And that's true to some extent of our worship as well. It's been kind of reduced to an almost like an entertainment venue rather than bringing our very best before God. And the liturgical traditions do tend toward a much more developed kind of architecture and ecclesiastical art, and the decorations on the inside of the church, the symbols that are used, and the beautiful color and the workmanship, the craftsmanship of those buildings, and of the beautiful music, and even the liturgy itself, even the worship itself is a finely crafted, poetic form, largely influenced by traditional Jewish worship. There's really strong parallels between traditional liturgy in the Christian church and synagogue worship back in first century Palestine. So a lot of that tradition has been lost. And I think what happened is the evangelical Christians, we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater a bit. We got a little like I said earlier in the program, we overcorrected for idolatry, and we've become almost allergic to the visual arts as a result, and we've forgotten that we have to bring that before the Lord as well. And when we do, we will be blessed, because ultimately, when we worship God fittingly, we are transposed. We find ourselves moving into the precincts of the transcendent, and we really encounter God in fresh ways. Interestingly, through those traditional forms of worship and the beauty that was lavished upon those buildings and that music and that art. And you asked the question about millennials. A lot of the millennials are being attracted to the traditional liturgical churches, and that's partly why, because they want beauty. They're hungry. Mm-hmm. It's almost as though there's a vitamin deficiency that we have as a culture that can only be fulfilled by a true encounter with beauty again. And I think the evangelical church needs to take stock of this and realize, it's God that he deserves our best. And when we bring our best before God, what will happen is people will come too. People will notice. They'll say, this is a God who is respected and honored in these beautiful buildings, and this beautiful music, and this beautiful art. And I think that will attract people as well. I don't think we can do it in order to attract people.
Yeah.
Millennials or otherwise. But I think they will naturally want to come when they sense that God is being honored and that there's a sense of encounter with the transcendent.
Yeah, I think we need to listen to what the millennials, Gen Z, whoever it is, are saying, and as you say, don't do it because of them, but listen to the truth that is inherent in the statements they're making and what they're reaching out for. And if you read in the Old Testament about the building of the tabernacle, there was so much imagery that was beautiful, and it was beautiful for beauty's sake. And I'll qualify that.
It's thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling. In fact, several chapters in Exodus are devoted to the detail of the artistic craftsmanship that Bezalel and Aholiab were called to do. And it says, by the way, the very first person in the Old Testament mentioned as being filled with the Spirit of God is Bezalel, the artist.
Yeah, that's great.
And he was filled with the Spirit of God to create works of beauty.
Yeah. Yeah, and so much was, if you in Second Chronicles, for instance, Solomon built these pillars that were decorative. He made chains and put them on top of the pillars and hung pomegranates on top of them. You don't put decoration on top of a pillar if it's meant to hold up a structure. It was just there for beauty, you know.
Absolutely. Just like the physical universe that God has created, is just overflowing with gratuitous beauty that has no other purpose than to adorn his beautiful world that he has created.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time, and I thought, Bruce, first of all, I would want to encourage people to go to your website, and maybe they're budding artists that would like to get some advice. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that maybe there's some young people out there that would like to actually go to Gordon College and study with you. So tell us what might be available for some of them that might be thinking about heading off to college and really want to go into the fine arts.
Well, yeah, I mean, we would love to have people come inquire at Gordon. It's a long way from home if you're down in Texas, but I know, which is where I imagine that's where your base is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we broadcast in 42 states, so there are a lot of people that are very close to you in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, so they could just drive right over there if they need to.
Well, we do get students from Texas, from Washington State, from California, from all over the country. But yeah, we'd love to have you come and visit our art department and talk with our admissions people. And we'll set up a portfolio review if a student is interested in bringing the work that they've been doing. And if you go to our website, the Gordon College website, and just type in art department, you'll see a lot about what our program is like. And then if you type in art portfolio guidelines, it'll tell you what you need to submit in order to apply to Gordon for the art major.
And again, that is gordon.edu, so that would give you all the information you need to know. It is also a great place to get a theological education as well, as many of us are well aware of as well. So, Bruce, we are sorry that you couldn't be in studio, but we are glad that you could join us by phone. And if you ever can make it back to Dallas, we'd love to have you in this studio as we talk about some of these very important issues on Point of View. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for your hospitality. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you, Bruce.
And Steve, it's great to have you here. He's on the other side of the glass. And for those of you that call the program, this is the man that you get a chance to talk to. And if you go online right now, you can actually see what he looks like. So that's kind of fun as well. But Steve, as you well know, we got our weekend edition tomorrow. So Penna Dexter will be sitting in that chair. Kelly Shackle will be sitting in that chair. I know we have Matt Krause as well. We'll be talking about some things on one of the Texas hours. But indeed, we will be talking about lots of issues in the news. Some of the concerns about civil liberties, some of the concerns about religious liberty, what we can do in terms of some of these political issues. And Penna Dexter's already identified one that is now starting to suggest that maybe we have to rethink how much more money we're going to throw at this issue and when it is possible that we can begin to put America back on its feet. So, Steve, I want to thank you for your help. Ivy and Andrew, thank you all for joining with us today. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just